there's this thing where you're supposed to like read the title of the talk that everybody can see. It only dawned on me like a few months ago that this is a tradition that came from when people didn't have slides and people actually did need to be told the title. Anyway, so let me say a little bit about what I want to do. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about the reception of Kripke's theory. And I also want to kind of talk about the background to some of Kripke's work. And in particular, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the kind of mathematics that was going on around when Kripke did paper. And what I need to tell you is, so unlike James's talk that actually had real results, real substance, this is going to be pretty vibe. This is the new word we have now, sort of vibe coding or vibe voting or something. I'm kind of serious about this. I kind of want to give you some of the vibes that, as best as I can tell, were going on way back when. I wasn't actually personally present for it, obviously, but there's some vibes. And those vibes overlap a lot with kind of aspects of the theory of truth that I happen to really like. And so a lot of what I want to do is just kind of let everybody know. Many people know this, but don't don't attend to it all the time. Stuff that I like goes around with theory of truth. And give you a little sense of kind of where Kripke's work came from. All right, so 75 was kind of good, right? We got that. I don't know. I was really looking to see if I could find the youngest, like photos of the youngest Saul I could find. I think that's it. And there, of course, is the paper, which it's hard to see, too small. But 75 was a kind of seminal year for those of us who think about truth and paradox. Things I think everybody in this room knows. I mean, since 75, Kripke techniques have become just the central technique. It's virtually impossible to do anything serious with theories of truth that you don't use this somehow or another. But the first thing I just wanted to remark a little bit on is that there are actually many different ways that the central technique has been seen, has been used. And as I said, there's one that I kind of like. So here are a few things that, again, I think in this room, most people are familiar with. So, I mean, this actually came up when Graham was asking a question earlier today, right? So one way of seeing what's going on in Kripke paper, and really natural way to see what's going on in Kripke paper, is that it's about getting a transparent truth predicate. Fixed points give you transparency properties, and that's like the paper. And if you are thinking about the transparency properties as central to what makes truth true, particularly like if you're a certain species of completionist, you probably think this, then you find yourself really almost by necessity thinking about non-classical. As Graham was saying, if you're really going to hold on to transparency, there aren't a lot of options here, other than, well, there are a lot of options, but they're all non-classical. So that's one way we've kind of absorbed what Kripke was up to. There's another way that's very common in the current literature, which is the sort of, the descent, KF and its cousins. Right, so the idea is another way that you can think about what was going on in Kripke's paper, not quite as explicitly, but certainly implicitly, and then became more explicit, was that it's kind of giving you a way to build classical axiomatic theories. Really, I mean, that's harder to spot in Kripke himself, but if you remember the old 84 Fefferman paper, of course, Useful Type Free Theories 1, Fefferman was reading Kripke and saying, I think I know how to do this. And so it began to emerge, I think it wasn't until 1990 that the actual official KF paper came out, but it was emerging. And so as we know, this has really exploded. There has been massive amounts of work on classical axiomatic theories of truth, mostly inspired by Kripke or things nearby to Kripke. And so for a lot of the current discussion, that's the way people tend to see things. But what I want to remind everybody of, and again, I suspect that most of you know this, but I'll remind you anyway, is that there's actually a third thing that's going on there. Oh, and I forgot before I go to the third thing, some of us like our classical theories contextualist. That's not really important for the talk. I just couldn't resist plugging what happens to be the view I like. So, Eduardo already quoted this, so I don't think we need to do it again. Just to remind you, the one thing about this passage, does everybody else have the experience I do? I just hear Kripke's voice when I read this. If I were to read it out, but you don't have to, because Eduardo already did, I would find myself like slipping into my fake Kripke accent. It's just his voice is here so much. But anyway, the idea that we've already talked about today, so it doesn't really need repeating, that Kripke himself did not seem to be heading down the non-classical path. And so perhaps you might think Kripke was at least partly heading down the path, the other path we just looked at, the kind of KF path, if you like. He is the K in KF after all. That's definitely part of it. But there's another passage that I want to direct your attention to, which is the opening footnote. And the reason I want to direct your attention to this is, you know, to some extent, this is the kind of footnote that every Kripke paper has, right? To some extent, it's, you know, it's not finished. I didn't really want to publish this. But actually, what I want to suggest is when it comes to the theory of truth paper, I actually think he literally means it. And one thing I'm going to do as the talk progresses is show you ways in which I think he really did. Right? There's a lot of stuff going that isn't fully articulated in the paper that I think is important. And so, when he says things like, I was already committed to something else and I had to do this in great haste without the opportunity to reflect. It's true. And so one of the things I'm going to be kind of trying to point to are some of the things that very much are in the background to what Kripke's doing. Some of them emerge very briefly in his paper, and some of them don't. So where are we here? Right, and so this is basically what I said. I want to talk a bit, and as I will going forward, as I said, this is the vibey part. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of mathematical background that was stuff that was happening in the 70s. And that I think it's important for the way that Kripke kind of proceeds. I think it's interesting because a lot of this mathematics is good old classical logic in the sense of things like generalized recursion or model theory or things that were logic, but classical. And I think that's actually quite important. And so I'm going to try and bring out a little more extensively some of the connections between what's going on with the actual Kripke paper and some of the stuff about definability and recursion theory. And as I said, I'll repeat this once more, it's going to be really vibey, like no actual theorems. Well, I'll state one, but that's about it. So really, as I said, I want to kind of bring out some of this background, kind of use it to think a little bit about the different ways that we can kind of get good stuff out of Kripke. And I should also say that I have no arguments, no brief to complain about any of the ways of receiving Kripke. I want to highlight one that I happen to like, but it's not like suggesting that there's anything wrong with any of the others. So, all right. You kind of know, if you know the literature, which I think most people in this room do, kind of that there is this other strand, which isn't quite the KF strand. I think this is most clearly illustrated by Van McKee's book, where it spends a lot of time on definability, spends a lot of time on kind of questions about complexity of truth predicates. And that's the kind of strand that I'm going to want to highlight. So what are we going to do? So here's the plan. Very casual history, tiny bit of detail to fill in the history, then talk a little more about specific stuff about truth, but it'll be commonly known results, very commonly known. And then I'll see if I can get any like payoffs, particularly for the kinds of approaches that I'm fond of. All right, so the history. 70s. Remember? Well, remember is a little unfair because I was like 8, but I was old enough that like people told me about the 70s who were there. It was the 70s. You know, also the 70s. Well, I have something slightly different in mind. What I have in mind is that, which was the 70s. It didn't involve hair bands or anything like that. But like one of the things that really was going on in the 70s was an explosion of work on definability theory. And as we'll talk about in a minute, that connects closely to lots of work in recursion theory, that there was this enterprise that really was very distinctive of the time, that actually is, at least as I like to think of it, kind of what Kripke was doing. And he was aware of this. I mean, this is not like a secret. It's just that as we think about non-classical or KF-oriented things, we kind of don't remember all this stuff. And so all I'm going to do is kind of talk about where it fits in, where things came from. Actually, I want you to go back further, because it turns out that 75 is not the only relevant date. We're going to go back to the 60s. Okay, you're going to guess there's silly images here to like the 60s, or the other silly image for the 60s. Right, it was the 60s. I was, the relevant date, I wasn't even born yet, so we're getting back a while. So it was the 60s. But something happened in the 60s. You can't actually see these because the images are too small, but these are 2 abstracts published in the JSL called Transfinite Recursion on Indivisible Ordinals 1, and immediately following it is Transfinite Recursion on Indivisible Ordinals 2. If I calculated right, Kripke was 24 when he published these, which was just amazing. He effectively invented a whole new subfield of logic at 24. Trying to think what I knew about logic at 24, and it's pretty good. But what I want to do is sort of tell you a little bit about what was going on in those abstracts, because I really do think that those abstracts were feeding what happens in 75. So I don't know if you know that, many of you will know this. So the tradition with the ASL is contributed papers, barely refereed. All you have to do is submit a short abstract. And the abstracts are checked for format, but for nothing else. And so it was sort of, he threw in 2 of those. Actually, there are 3 Kripke abstracts in that particular session, but I'm only going to mention the 2. So very short, very condensed, often cited, but not always read, partly because it is so dense. But I want to talk a bit about, like, what is this idea of transfinite recursion on an admissible ordinal? This should sound a little strange. Let me double check what my next slide is. Yeah. He was essentially involved in this, and that's the background. Yeah, before getting to that next one. So transfinite recursion. If you're not used to that phrase, that might sound a little funny. That means that we have transfinitely long computations that converge, and that might not be something everyone is used to. It works. Let me give you a quick mention of how you can make sense of transfinitely long computations. So you think that for ordinary finite computations, the relevant ordinal is omega. I'd like to get a computation that looks like omega plus omega. How do I do it? Run two ordinary computations in parallel. That effectively gets you the order type omega plus omega. Once you got that in mind, you can start thinking about what other ordinals are ones that I can make sense of recursion on. What you need here are a couple of things. You need to have an ordinal that has nice enough closure properties that you don't get out of it when you're doing recursion. And you also need enough to be able to do the recursion theorem, right? You need to get basic recursive function theory going. But if you think about it, as people were, doesn't absolutely require that omega is your only relevant ordinal. And so this was the big deal. And here we're going to get super vibey. I want to tell you a little bit about what things were going on. So this was, at least as best as I can tell. I really wish that I was around then. Sounds like it has to be an amazing time. All kinds of things had exploded. Recursion theory had massively taken off. All kinds of things, So central theorems about degrees of unsolvability had been uncovered in the 60s. All of a sudden, there's this whole new field in recursion. Similar with model theory, Morley categoricity theorem, if you know it, really was a central theorem that not only proved something really important, but kind of opened up new techniques in model theory. And hardly need to mention, set theory was happening a lot. There's another thing that really is sort of interesting about that time. This was a time not just in logic, but kind of all over mathematics. This was the time of obsessive generalization about everything. Right? So this is a time when, people who used to do ordinary number theory, all of a sudden were doing something called arithmetic algebraic geometry, where you have a highly abstract category theoretic way of representing which otherwise would have looked like an algebraic surface over a field, but it wasn't. And so, it was also the time when people were developing all these ways of assigning algebraic invariance to topological spaces, right? This was everything was abstract. Everything looked like category theory. There was a massive pressure towards generalization. If you happen to know any of the Grothendieck work, that will be your case in point for massive, massive, massive generalization. In contrast to now, nobody's doing that anymore. Real old-fashioned number theory, low-dimensional topology, actually studying real surfaces. Things changed. But at that time, there was just massive generalization. I think that's part of what got things going with generalized recursion theory. So here's Kripke in 60, whatever it was. Say, finite recursion. Sorry, I didn't slip Kripke for a second. Finite recursion, that's boring. What about transfinite? So there was a lot going. In fact, a whole bunch of things came together right around the same time. So Kripke's work on generalized recursion theory turns into recursion on ordinals, blissful set theory. Same time, Moskvakis and Spector and people like this are thinking about definability theory, which turns out to overlap substantially with generalized recursion theory to the point where it might be the same thing. You can And then stuff that I'm not really going to get to talk about much, but that really was also amazing. You know, it's the 60s and 70s. We're generalizing everything. Why should logic only have finite formulas? Well, pretty obvious. Maybe it doesn't have to. But it turned out, really centrally because of Barwise's thesis, that infinitary logic, generalized recursion theory, miscible set theory, all come down to the same. And it also sneaks in to Kripke's theory of truth. So I thought at this point, because that really was the very vibey side, I needed to show you a little bit. This is going to be also pretty condensed, but I want to kind of show you what an admissible ordinal is. And I'm going to do it not quite Kripke's way. In fact, if you look at the Kripke abstracts, he has a kind of more traditional recursive theoretic way of doing this. And it has turned out that for the applications that Kripke had in mind, the difference didn't matter much, but this has become the thing people have settled on. So this is work of Barwise, Sachs, lots of other people get involved. So I want to show you what makes an admissible ordinal. And what the trick is, following from Barwise, is I'm going to start by showing you a weak set theory. Weak compared to ZFC, but strong enough to get you those nice properties I mentioned a few minutes ago. Strong enough to allow you to do things like recursion. Strong enough to give you ordinals that have decent closure properties. And the nice thing is because it's weak, it's going to turn out that you can find lots of those ordinals. And so what do? Here's the Barwise, actually Playtech, I believe, is the one for the original one. Here's one version. There are theories, like got some average stuff, extensionality, foundation, pairing, union, throw them all in. But the crucial powerful axioms we're going to restrict. So separation is going to be restricted to delta zero formulas. That basically means all your quantifiers are bounded. And then we're going to sneak in a little more, which is a collection principle, kind of like a replacement principle. But it turns out, because these theories are weak, it's a little fussy just how you formulate this. And this turned out to be the right thing. So, notice what it's telling you is for a delta zero formula, if for all x there's a y, then I can collect together the y's. So it's close to replacement, but not quite. That's KP for Kripke Playtech set theory. And as I mentioned, it's weak, but it is just enough to get you the things you want. It can get you things like that, the Levy hierarchy works reasonably well, right? You don't have to get too stressed about exactly where your quantifiers go, so long as you do it basically right. You can do little bits of replacement, and you can do the recursion theorem. Right. What about the ordinals? Kripke was interested specifically in transfinite ordinals that would be good for recursion. How we do it, well, in the current version, the kind of Playtech-inspired version, what we're going to do is we're just going to first mention that an admissible set is a set that's model of KP for it to be transitive, just to keep things simple. And if you have an admissible set, there will be a first ordinal that's not in it. That's the ordinal associated with that set. Admissible ordinals are exactly the first ordinals that are not in the set. Turns out, for recursion theoretic purposes, you can restrict your attention to very small models of set theory. Basically, you can always work with constructible sets. So if you're looking for an admissible ordinal, it's always going to be the ordinal of a relevant bit of the constructible hierarchy. So for recursion theoretic purposes, you don't even need to worry about all that many different sets. So now we have this idea of an admissible ordinal. There are some familiar admissible ordinals. First of all, the hereditarily finite sets are a model of KP. That means that omega is your first admissible ordinal. And we know what the next one is, though this is one of those results that's actually rather hard and takes work. But the next one up, if you're familiar with sort of recursion theoretic work, it's the Church-Kleene ordinal. That's the first non-recursive ordinal. It's also an ordinal that you get when you look at the notation systems that Kleene was working with. So now we have at least a couple. Omega, good for doing recursion. Omega 1 CK is also great for doing recursion, as Kleene kind of knew. This generalizes some ideas that were there. And once you go looking, there are a lot more. For anything, any admissible set, you can always get a bigger admissible set. That means you can always get a bigger admissible ordinal. So these are going to keep going. Oh, right, this is what I said. Right, so infinitely long computations converge. Turns out this project worked. What I was really struck to see when I was rereading these abstracts was what Kripke had already said in '64. These are quotes. The basic terms of recursion theory in Kleene's book all go through for recursion theory on any admissible ordinal. Ordinary recursion theory is a special case of, and then he just mentions offhand that he thinks he has a generalized version of Friedberg-Lipschitz theorem, one of the central results that made contemporary recursion theory what it is, results about the recursive numeral solvability. And so I just really wanted to, because this is retrospective about Kripke, just wanted to stop and remark how amazing this is. Like, he had gone through and checked all the central results. Kleene's book is really big. He'd gone through and checked all of these, and he'd worked at the Friedman-Lipschitz theorem, if you've ever had to walk through it, is an extremely difficult proof. And he had already figured out that he could get a version of that. 24-year-old Kripke, pretty smart guy. All right, so as I said, and this worked. Sachs's book is one of the least user-friendly books ever written, but it contains lots of, basically the ideas, as Sachs likes to put it, classic results in set theory, things about degrees of unsolvability, lift. They work basically well on bigger ordinals. That is amazing. And though I think we're now used to it, that should have come as quite a surprise. You know, again, as I was saying, if has everybody, how many of you have been subjected to the Friedberg-Lipschitz theorem? Okay, only a few of us. Remember, it was, as I was going through that, I would not have thought, oh, this will work for transfinite cases too. That's not what I would have thought. Now, I do want to get back to something that's closer to our main, because there's this really good central admissible set known as hype. Hype is the thing that's really close to what Kripke's up to. And so in a way, the whole point here is just that the space of kinds of definability results that are central to what Kripke's doing, things like, first of all, that you have fixed points, things like that those fixed points have recognizable complexity. Those are all things that are basically going on in the world of hype and its cousins. It is what's usually described as the next admissible set. So you start with HF, that's the smallest one. The next admissible is hype. Hype for hyper-elementary, because it was also close to hyper-arithmetic. So hype was like the label that covered it all. Hype is very nice. Oh, but also it's very important that this iterates. You can do hype. That actually is kind of, I think, really important. So I felt like I had to quote one theorem. So here's one of the central results on hype, which shows you that being in hype is being, well, up there, delta 1, and being sort of recursive, the analog of recursive being enumerable hype is pi. These are relevant because that's the Kripke fixed point. And that's the Tarskian truth predicate. So these categories are really central to what we're doing in truth. And they just naturally show up as nice things that we can work on in or over type. So the way I like to put it is this is the playground. If you're interested in just studying the fixed points, this is your playground. And it's nice. So let's see. One more bit of generalization. This actually gets one more level complicated. Because what I showed you really was thinking about hereditarily finite sets. Think of those as a lot like the natural numbers. Really thinking about starting with recursion theory on ordinary numbers and trying to generalize that up a little bit. But because KP is a really weak theory, that doesn't quite guarantee us that we have as much stuff in our playground. So what happened, and this is bar-wise, is we're going to relativize all of this to a structure. And this gets extremely fussy, and I really didn't want to type out all the details. The idea is that your structure gives you a domain that's going to function as Bohr elements. KP is so weak that Bohr elements count, right? Because you're not guaranteed to have a pure set that gets everything like a Bohr element. And so what we're going to do, here again, I did want to skip the details because they're painful, is you want to think of this as all being relativized to a given structure. And so when we think, so the idea is you start with a structure. Maybe it's the natural numbers. Maybe it's another structure that you find interesting. And you think about what's definable over that structure. And if you think about what's definable in terms of what you can get out of KF, you get height above that structure. And as I said, you can keep going. So that's the world. As it were, that's the playground. It turns out, one more detail, the best theorems come when we make a slight back off from massive generalization. Because arbitrary structures are kind of hard to work. So the best results, this I think was Moskovakis' Kleene insight, was that you want reasonably nice structures. Reasonably nice means having a coding system. And if you happen to know the details, reasonably nice means having an elementary definable coding system. That's going to be obviously important for anybody thinking about truth, because the coding system is going to give you the names of the formulas, right? If you don't have the coding, you're not going to get anywhere. So for work on truth, we always want what Moskovakis called an acceptable structure, but actually lots of good results really work best in this environment. People tried, after Moskovakis' book, to see if they could do away with the acceptable structures. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Yeah, and so before getting on to a couple of comments actually about truth predicates, just to quickly kind of wrap up this section, as I said, it was just cool stuff. But also, and more generalizations you can get, right? So admissible sets give you control over infinitary logics, all kinds of stuff that admissible sets do for you. But mostly, as I was saying, it's a nice environment to play around with truth predicates. So let's do a tiny bit of that. Just a tiny bit. There are lots of results here. And the point is just that hype gives you a lot of good stuff. And though hype is not the only admissible set, it's our favorite, one that everybody works with all the time, and it allows good stuff. I'm just going to mention a couple of results. This is one that I really like, even though it's not that difficult. This is the observation that Tarski's theorem, Tarski's undefinability theorem, in this playground has a very nice model theoretic and definability theoretic version, which Moskowakis wrote down. It is basically Tarski's theorem, but it's Tarski's theorem without actually like doing, if you do it in a contemporary form, you start with PA or something. This you can do entirely model theoretically, partly because we work with an acceptable structure, which means it has coding, which means we can do some of the stuff that you were doing it axiomatically, you'd get out of PA. And here's the result. Over an acceptable structure, Moskowakis actually does satisfaction, but it applies for truth too, is not elementary, but is delta 1, 1, which means it's in height, which means it is relatively simple. And by the mantra of generalized recursion theory, that's the analog of finite. In height is nice in the way that finite is nice. So there's a result here, not that hard, but general in a really impressive way. You can't get out of Tarski's undefinability theorem unless you do horrible things to your ground structure. Actually, you can if you do horrible things to your ground structure, that's known, but don't. And then a sequence of results. First one is due to Kripke. And actually, probably, it wouldn't surprise me if some of these were known to Kripke and they're quite native to like records somewhere. He was playing around with this a lot. So Kripke already stated the observation that the positive extension of the minimal fixed point under the strong Kleene evaluation scheme is pi 1, 1 complete. And actually, when you start working through the literature on this, lots of fixed points are pi 1, 1 complete. That kind of gives you a feel for something important about what the truth predicates are like. First of all, that means that they're not in height. That means that they really are a big bump up in complexity. But they're not uncontrollable. Because they have this proform, they're sigma 1 on height, that means they're kind of behaving like recursively enumerable stuff. That means that it's not totally unworkable, but it's way, way bigger. I actually think in my own work, I've claimed that this is really important. I kind of think that the idea that a non-trivial truth predicate really provides you with a much, much more complex kind of set of definability resources. I think that's important. Happens to be for the work I've done, but it's also just a nice result. And then, of course, we're off and running. Lots of results in this vicinity. Many, many, many of them. Some of them, another thing you can do if you want is you can translate truth predicates into infinitary logics. And you can do all kinds of stuff about nicely behaved infinitary logics. McGee got this really pretty and non-trivial result. Some of these results are hard. There are no two disjoint co-inductive sets that give you a Kripke pair fixed point. Non-trivial, including McGee apologizing for part of the proof, because I don't know if you remember, a lot of these proofs, what you have to do is take something that looks very nice and easy when you do it in this kind of non-classical setting with extension and anti-extension, and redo it in a much more ugly way because you have to have everything being positive, but you don't have the anti-extension. And so what you wind up doing is writing 3-page long formulas, which McGee apologizes for, but it works. And then you can also get these results. Some of these things really get interestingly complex. So Burgess was asking back in the 80s, I believe, what about other fixed points? Can we get complexity results for those? They're pretty delicate. And so he worked very hard to get that for the maximum intrinsic fixed point under supervaluations, there's your complexity measure. So once you start doing this, by the way, I don't have a great intuitive sense of why delta 1, 2 and a pi 1, 2 parameters, that doesn't resonate with me as like an obviously salient category. But then again, also, like I have never found maximum intrinsic fixed points to be the most convenient truth predicates. So perhaps I'm just not getting the vibe here. Let's see, we're almost done. Just to wrap up, are there any morals here? And sort of, I mean, as I said, a lot of what I really wanted to do today was just kind of get back back to this idea that Kripke's 75 paper arose out of other stuff of Kripke's. And by the way, yeah, I'm very curious about something. Anybody know if he has like standing notes on admissible sets in the archives? These abstracts must not have been the only things he wrote down. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to highlight that there's a progression here, that he started off thinking about generalized recursion theory, went over to truth and said, oh, wait, I know how to do this stuff. In a sense, he already had it in his pocket. Not, I think, like the Nixon-Dean argument. There's lots of other stuff in the paper that wasn't just definability theory, but he already had the definability theory in his pocket. And I think if you're interested in the kind of classical mathematics of truth predicates, which not everybody is, as I said, this is kind of like the thing that I got find interesting, that this is where you want to do it. This is the kind of set of resources you need to study the complexity and the variety of classically understood fixed points. So that, I think, is good. I think I had one more thing I wanted to say. And then, yeah. I couldn't resist sort of plugging my own work here. I guess that's sort of okay. I think that type is useful for building hierarchies. So as some of you know, I'm one of these people who's still at least somewhat Tarskian. I think that broadly stratified approaches to truth are the best way to get around the strengthened liar. But one thing that I've been pushing is that you want to be as Kripkean as you can, because those are much more appealing counts of truth than the traditional Tarskian ones. And so the thought is that you want to build something that looks like a Kripke fixed point. You want to build something that's signal 1 on height. But if you're doing a hierarchy, that's not going to be the end. So the strengthened liar is going to come in, and you're going to have to jump up. How do you jump up? Next admissible set. Gives you a uniform way to jump up to something. And each of those is a seriously substantial jump up in complexity. So what we can then sort of see is if you like hierarchies, on the one hand, you can sneak in a little bit of Kripke. So one thing is that I think I've always claimed partially defangs the Nixon-Dean style cases. Not totally, right? I mean, Kripke fixed points are not perfect, but it gives you at least a certain amount of self-applicative truth. It gives you a certain amount of the idea that truth finds its own levels. But if you think that when the strengthened liar comes in, you're going to have to jump up in the level, what I want is to jump up a lot. I don't want to make little jumps, because then it just feels very Tarskian. So using next admissible constructions gives you an open-ended way to make really big complexity jumps. And if you, like me, that's what I think is the right answer. But anyway, it's not really supposed to, this talk wasn't really supposed to be about my work. It was how cool it was that Kripke discovered all this stuff and put it all together in 75. Anyway, I'll stop with that.